I have to make this one remark. The Second Lebanon War, they let us go in. At some point, I don't know if it was before the stage that I was talking of, but they did let us go in. And then there were claims from the IDF, why are journalists going in to the war zone? And as a result of this, the IDF spokesman from Cast led, also and all the way up to Protective Edge and column of defense. There wasn't actually ground forces then, but the IDF spokesman prevented us from entering the war zone. So you might ask, where is this Itai story? Where is it coming from? Itai story is coming up because the media didn't go in. Now, not because they don't have enough brave people who want to report from the field, but because they had to keep broadcasting. And that OB vehicle, the mobile broadcast vehicle, was next to the border. That it couldn't enter. And so the journalists who would usually accompany the forces, they all remained on the border and reported from the border because they didn't have time to see the war that they were reporting, because they had to be in that plasma, that endless plasma of 24/7 of live broadcast.
Now I'd like to call upon MK Ofer Shelah. He's a former military reporter. Today he's a politician. To tell us about things from his perspective these days. Yeah, you're talking about today, right? I want to start by saying, in continuation to what Itai said, because I want to challenge some of the things that came up from his words. Itai said, justly, that the war of today, we grew up, even as readers, the model was Hemingway. You know, Hemingway once said that he liberated the bar of the Ritz Hotel in Paris because, you know, these days that people would ride with there's a wonderful book that just came out in Hebrew now of the reporters of Hemingway. Anyway, these are days that the media is not what we have today. It's not just 24/7, but it's also a much longer leg between the event and the reporting. And you're actually reporting to people that don't know what's going on until you tell them, because there are no any alternative information sources. And Itai is right by saying that the journalist should put things in order. But I say that the conflict between that and the wish to be there, sometimes creates difficulty or a contradiction. When I saw the wonderful reportage of Itai, I'm sorry, I didn't see the heroism of combatants. I saw a force that did not fulfill its mission, and it bothered me as an older veteran soldier. And by the way, also the statement of the soldier that you quoted really bothers me. And I think that was typifying the Second Lebanon War and the public reaction to the war, is a great empathy to the soldiers, which is understood, because they are our children after all, and we call them our children. So Protective Edge, I was the first time a father. It's a completely different experience than to go through it yourself when you were a father of a soldier. But in that, to a great extent, we are in a society which is in conflict all the time. And now we went to a different pole. Now there's a pole where the excitement and the emotions hide the commentary, not just to sit in a studio and this, but also the commentary of the viewer and the journalist, the objective recognition, and which goes against emotions. And in the present wars, I think that the work of a journalist from the Second Lebanon War, I asked to go in and they didn't allow me, and I didn't feel the need or the urge to do it. I don't feel that I don't have enough information if I'm not right there. And a day after the battle in Binj Bail, I went to the commander and I heard a description. And I'm not sure that had I been inside, I would know more. But the real happening in the Second Lebanon War and in Protective Edge was not in the battlefield. The real happening was in the room where the decisions were made, the dramas, the real failures, the real story was there, and the capability to obtain it, although it's not just a great glory, and it doesn't really give you what I call read background to the battle. It was in Tel Aviv, in the headquarters office. So how do you do it? Finally, you have standards as a journalist, no matter if you're in the midst of the battle or in Tel Aviv. And if you report the truth, if you know how to select what you're saying, and you give a context to the occurrences, etc. But my message is the following. This is a much more complicated war in a much more complicated environment. It's a war that the relations between what's happening in the battlefield and in the decision-making office is a completely different relationship, because in the Six-Day War, maybe two great decisions were made. One to wage war, and the second to go to the Golan Heights. In the middle, there was battlefields, there was war. And as opposed to that, in Protective Edge, which took 8 times longer than the Six-Day War, the question is what's happening in the room where the cabinet is meeting, I think, was much more important than what's happening in the battlefield. Not to mention, when we talk about a society where at the end of the day, unfortunately, because we keep being in war all our lives, the attitude of the people who know what it looks like there's a lot of people, many people in the society, to know the fear when you walk in. You know, in the Second Lebanon War, there was a phenomenon which was a commanding mistake. They put in forces, took out forces. You didn't have to be there in order to know that the soldier who's taken out of the battlefield to refresh himself, much more difficult to bring him back again after that. Many of us were there. Many of us know what happened there. So in that respect, this direct experience had, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying that there's a detachment from the classic model, the way we knew it, to wars where the political decisions and decision-making are much more important, and at the end of the day, the service to the reader or to the viewer is in both. And what we knew in the worlds that we grew, if you're not there, you don't know what's happening, I'd say that it's not true. But there's an interaction. I'm not contradicting it. But there's an interaction between the media in the battlefield and the decision-making, no? Don't you think there's a connection? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. And a military reporter like Ron, and Ron, I think, got a medal as a reporter in the battlefield. But if you take somebody like Ronnie Daniel, that in the Six-Day War, he walked for a kilometer in the Suez Canal with his battalion. This is an experience that I'm not sure many soldiers do today. And it was, he knows exactly what it looks like. He knows. He doesn't have to be there himself to know what's happening. And that serves him to do other things. Maybe he can decipher what he's told in a better way. But the question that Ron wanted me to talk about is the issue of the impact on the media on decision-making. It's very difficult to say things that are decisive. I think that more than the media has an impact in real time, the idea of the media And I'll illustrate what I mean. The idea of the media is in the heads of the decision-making. Amos was the head of intelligence in the Second World War. I think he'll agree with me that, for example, the question of casualties, of losses that we deal with, more than it is discussed in the Israeli media in real time, more than it was in the head of the decision makers as a social data that has an impact on their decisions, and what was reported at that moment, it has less impact than in the preliminary kind of thinking. But this thing has to do to the things I said in the beginning, because at the end of the day, media deals with perceptions, and it touches the ego of people, and its impact is not necessarily through the fact that it really has an impact in the public opinion that then boomerangs back to the leaders, but a priori the leaders treat it as a figure, and the public opinion, sometimes they take preliminary decisions that are not because of the media. I have a feeling that the Israeli society is much less sensitive to casualties during wartime than what the decision makers think. I think that protective edge is an example. What happens after it is also an example. The Israeli society went very quickly to regular life, something that I think are very, very poignant questions about the quality of the fighting of IDF during protective edge. Tactically operative, it was very convenient to put it aside, to say they are military people, they understand. It was very easy to say it's not so important, or there was maybe a fear to deal with that because we were afraid to tell ourselves that this army, for us, it's not just a professional army that people who are mercenaries. It's our children, it's us. We serve in the army, and just the thought that maybe the army is not as good as we think it is, this frightens us so much that we'd rather just push it aside. We don't want to deal with it. And I connect it to the question of the casualties. 66 military dead during the protective edge. I'm not talking now about cost. You cannot say always if it's at the right price, so I don't use these words. What does it show the level of planning and fighting and performance? The society doesn't deal with that at all. Neither does the media. And if the media was there, do you think it would be different? No, on the contrary, I think if they were there, they wanted praise. They wanted, because if you walk around with a guy like Toledano, a very good officer, and you say, I don't know if I would do better than him, and then by the way, the reportage also serves the ethos that we wanted to serve. But then later on, the question whether the paratroopers division headed by this Toledano, how come it was sent to its mission? How did they do it? Nobody asks it. Nobody deals with it. And I'll tell you more than that. This, by the way, has an impact also on the investigations within the army itself. And I'm saying it in this forum, although it's an open forum, but still, I relate it as a forum of people who are interested in this subject, and they're able to discuss it with open eyes. I'm telling you, I have a feeling that, for example, for protective edge and operative questions that come up, no question of our policy against the Hamas. These questions, not only the media and the public pushed it aside, but it enables the army also not to deal with them. I want to conclude. I spoke to Gabi before. I just want to give an example because I understand that the headline is fighting in urban areas. I want to tell you an anecdote that came up from our investigation of the Foreign and Security Commission in Protective Edge. I hope I'm not revealing any military secrets. In the beginning of the war, when the bombs started in Gaza, there was a message from a very senior person in the civilian corps in Gaza that arrived at the Chief of Staff, Benny Gantz, and it had to do with the devastation by the bombs, and asked the Chief of Staff to have mercy on the Gaza citizens. I'll tell you what he answered. You cannot condemn war in harsher words than me. War is cruel. You cannot make it delicate, and those who brought it upon us deserve all the hits that we can. I had nothing to do with its breakout, and nobody is going to sacrifice more than me to achieve peace. If you stop introducing the war into your houses, into your schools, then we will protect you. I know that it's difficult to oppose to the terror and hate that's among you, but you can throw out those who brings war upon you. You should appeal to them rather than to us regarding the war. We cannot prevent it. The only way that the Gazians can hope for peace and quiet is to stop the war. The way to start this is to admit that you waged war out of a mistake, and you are continuing in the same way. So as you guess, of course, such a letter never came to the Chief of Staff, and this is definitely not his answer. You know where it's taken from? What I thought the Thai knows. Nothing to do with us. In 1864, General Sherman came to Atlanta in the Civil War. He was an American, Atlanta, the mayor was Calhoun. He sent a letter to Sherman, and this is part of Sherman's answer. And then he directed to evacuate Atlanta, and he burnt it to the ground. What do I want to tell you? These things exist in war from time immemorial. These issues have been in war always. The phenomenon of war does not change, and we have to cope with it and its horrors. And these words of General Sherman are very important to learn. By the way, during the war, one of the Arab MKs who knows my views called me and he said, you have to do something because children are dying there. And I read this letter to him, not in order to show him that we are right, but because in my eyes, the way to stop the horror of wars is to prevent it and to change it, and not to try to change it while it's happening.